This time it's classic 250s of the 1970s. By the start of the 1950s, it was all changed in the 250 market. The British had all but completely disappeared, and their place had been taken by a range of Japanese machines, but there were still a few European contenders. This was really an epoch for 250cc machines. It was an era of unrivaled choice and variety. But as the world moved into the 1980s, it was all change. The learner laws in Britain changed, and the 250 market imploded completely. But for now, let's look back at 5 classic ranges of 250 machines. The Honda CB250N Superdream. In the 60s, Honda made its name with machines like the CB72 and the larger 305cc CB77. But by the 70s, these bikes have been swept away by an all-new range of CBs. These used single overhead cam like the earlier bikes, but now employed 5-speed gearboxes, on top of a range of other mechanical improvements. Overall styling was definitely more conservative than the earlier bikes, but these were generally better machines, better handling, better brakes, and much smoother, more refined engines. But in '78, Honda replaced these with the all-new Dream model. This used Comstar wheels and a completely new engine with balance shafts and a 3-valve cylinder head. The styling was fairly classic Honda curvy, and the machine in the United States was of course known as the Hawk, but in the UK it was fairly short-lived, being rapidly replaced in 1978 by the Superdream. Mechanically, the Superdream was very little different from the previous model. It still used the same engine and same frame. But the styling language was completely different. It was now brought into line with the all-new CB750 and CB900 dual overhead cam models, although of course the engine in the Superdream was not dual overhead cam. The Superdream was a sales success for Honda, but it was rather large, being based on a 400cc model after all. So it was quite weighty. In fact, Motor Guzzi V50 of the same era was a fair bit lighter. Honda would claim a top speed of 90 miles an hour, but you'd be very lucky to see that even in its prime. 85 is nearer the mark, so in reality it's very little quicker than a 1960s British 250. But it is a very smooth and refined bike. You could definitely ride this bike on the motorway and go touring on it, because the bike is big enough to carry 2 people in comfort, although admittedly not at very high speeds. So if you're looking to buy one today, these are fairly good choices for classic machines, the only weakness being the tank, which is prone to rust. The rest of the bike though is pretty solid, so a good choice for a 70s classic. Suzuki's 2-stroke parallel twin series. In 1969, Suzuki replaced their popular T20 series with an all-new Suzuki T250, sometimes known as the Hustler. This employed a parallel twin 2-stroke engine of square dimensions of 54x54, identical to those, incidentally, of the Ariel Leader. The machine used fairly basic piston port induction, but produced a claimed 32 horsepower at 8,000 RPM, and to help keep the little engine on the boil, they gave it a 6-speed gearbox. Automatic oiling was of course fitted as standard. The machine used drum brakes all round to try and rein in its 320 pounds dry weight. The chassis was fairly typical of the time, so the suspension combination wasn't the best available. The Japs still had some work to do to catch up with the Europeans at this point, but they were getting there. But for all its relative sophistication, the T250 was fairly short-lived, being replaced in 1972 after just 3 years of production. And in its place would be the all-new GT250. This used disc brakes for the first time, and used ram air on the cylinder head. Whether the ram air actually did anything is a matter of opinion, but it really did look cool, didn't it? The GT did employ the same basic architecture as the T models, same bore and stroke, same 6-speed gearbox. But by this point, Suzuki had got a major drive to make their bikes more user-friendly, so the GT was becoming increasingly smooth and more refined than its earlier stablemates. At the end of the 70s, Suzuki would modify the engine further to include reed valves in its induction circuit. And this machine would be the X7, a machine capable of pretty much 100 miles an hour, and one of the machines that contributed to the downfall of the 250 learner class. The Yamaha RD series. In the early 70s, Yamaha replaced their successful R series with the new RD series, RD standing for Race Developed. In some territories these machines are known as RZs, Australia and the United States for example, or of course RZ for our American listeners. All the RD series share the same basic engine layout and overall design architecture, very slab-sided. The range was quite broad, but all the initial bikes were two-stroke parallel twins with ranges of 125, 200, 250, 350 and 400 cc's. All the engines had the same square-finned, very narrow overall appearance. Reed valve induction was used and there were some elements of tuning on the exhaust. Now, contrary to popular belief, Yamaha did not invent reed valve induction. It's actually much older than that. But as a musical instrument manufacturer, they were well placed to really know how to get the best out of the system, and they very much did. And the RDs were some of the first smaller capacity bikes to make use of cast wheels and disc brakes. Overall performance of the 250 was around 30 horsepower. The machine weighed in at just 152 kilos dry, so top speed was pretty much 90 miles an hour, making it one of the fastest 250s available during the mid-70s. The machine has much in common with the Suzuki alternative. It is a 6-speed gearbox, but the general character of the engine is very different. The Yamaha is designed to be more raucous and higher performing. Consequently, it has a bigger reputation in the classic world and commands higher prices overall. The entire RD range was commercially successful, the 250 in particular of course, because it was able to be ridden by learner riders. If you're on a modern learner or 125 licence, the RD Twin makes an excellent choice if you're looking for a classic motorcycle. The RDs have become popular classics, so cheap ones are very hard to find. The 250 ran up until 1980 when it was replaced by the 250 LC, and that is an altogether very different story, because the LC was undoubtedly the final nail in the coffin of the learner 250 laws. Kawasaki KH250. Kawasaki introduced its range of two-stroke triples way back in 1968, but it wasn't until 1972 that we see the first 250 models, giving those on a learner licence an undoubted touch of glamour, because the yowl of these three-cylinder two-strokes was indeed intoxicating. There really was nothing else like it on the learner market, then or now. The initial 72 model was called the S1, but in 76 it was replaced by the KH. The KH was heavily based on its larger 400 stablemate, which meant that the chassis was a bit on the heavy side, but it was at least a bit more rigid, so unlike many of Kawasaki's triples, it could at least go around the corners fairly well. By then pretty much standard for the time, the KH made use of a disc front brake and a drum rear, and the suspension was a little improved, so it was a touch less weave happy than the earlier models, particularly those of larger capacity. Now, 3 cylinders it may have been, but the engine itself was fairly unsophisticated, being just a piston-ported 2-stroke, with of course air cooling. And those triple silencers sticking out the back may have added weight, but they did look pretty cool also. And for a learner rider, cool is very important. Weighing in at 160 kilos, the bike was a touch heavier than the twin-cylinder opposition, and at 28 horsepower it was a little less powerful too. Top speed was around the 90 miles an hour mark. So although in the mid-70s it was fairly competitive, by the end of the 70s, at the advent of bikes such as the X7, the KH was trailing behind somewhat in the performance stakes. Nevertheless, the bike remained popular, because those 3 cylinders and the sound they made was rather like having a stereo that turned up to 11. It was just something you had to have. And of course, largely because of its association with the larger bikes such as the 750, the little 250 remains a popular classic, so prices are high for this model. But is that wonderful exhaust note really worth the extra cash? Maybe. The MZ, Trophy and TS range. Now you may well wonder why I'm including MZ in a group of classic 250s from the 1970s, but the fact is these machines were big sellers and remain very popular today in the classic world. The Trophy was introduced in 71 and has decidedly individualistic styling, which some people really do like. And with its unusual suspension system and odd styling, it does have a sort of Soviet kitsch about it. In its own way, it's really cool. Kind of like Bakelite radios and Volkswagen Beetles. The Trophy's engine was of course a single-cylinder piston-ported two-stroke. It made around 19 horsepower at 5,000 RPM, so which was fairly respectable for a commuter bike, but of course not exactly sporty. Brakes all round with drums, and there was no auto lube when first introduced. So you may wonder why on earth they were so popular, and the fairly obvious answer is they were really cheap. But not only that, they also had a reputation for toughness. Those things will just run on and on. They cornered pretty well and were generally fun to ride, surprisingly. But in 73 the Trophy was out and in came the all-new TS. Well, it wasn't initially all new actually. The suspension and chassis setup was new, but initially the bike was fitted out with the old ETS 19 horsepower engine. This would later be replaced by the all-new TS motor. This was similarly piston ported, but had that unusual fin layout which is often described as slices of toast piled on top of one another. They also came up with an ingenious rubber mounting system where the engine just kind of bounces up and down in the frame. The system was very effective. A tick over the engine bounces all over the place and the bars shake, but once you're up to speed it smooths out wonderfully and gives a surprisingly sophisticated ride. And to top it all, they even gave the TS a 5-speed gearbox. Luxury. The TS makes a popular, reliable budget classic. The only downside is it lacks an auto lube, something rectified in the later ETZs, but that bike doesn't quite have the style. What other collections of bikes would you like us to look at? Perhaps you have a machine we can use for a road test. Either way, get in touch. I do hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.